probably think you know history. After all, you sat through years of school, memorizing dates, names, and events. But what if I told you that some of the most astonishing, world-changing moments never made it into your textbooks? Imagine a world where the stories you know are only half the truth, where the real lessons, the ones that challenge, shock, and inspire, are hidden just out of sight. Today, we're pulling back the curtain. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the past forever. Let's start with a simple question. Why do some stories get told while others are left in the shadows? It's not just about time or space in a curriculum, it's about power. The stories we learn in school are carefully chosen, shaped by those who want to control the narrative. Sometimes it's to protect a nation's image. Sometimes it's to avoid uncomfortable truths. And sometimes it's just easier to stick to the familiar. But history is messy, complicated, and full of surprises. And the stories that get left out, they're often the ones that matter most. Take a moment to think about the history you learned in school. Chances are it was a story of progress, of great leaders, heroic battles, and inevitable triumphs. But what about the stories of loss, injustice, and resistance? What about the voices that were silenced, the events that were erased? These are the stories that reveal the true complexity of our world. They show us that history isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to decide what matters. So, why do schools leave out certain events? Sometimes it's about national pride. No country wants to dwell on its darkest moments. Other times it's about controversy. Some stories are just too painful, too divisive, or too challenging to teach. And sometimes it's just ignorance. The people who write textbooks and design curriculums don't always know the full story themselves. But whatever the reason, the result is the same: a version of history that's incomplete, sanitized, and frankly misleading. But here's the thing: the truth always finds a way. Thanks to researchers, activists, and ordinary people who refuse to let the past be forgotten, we now have access to stories that were once hidden. And when you hear them, you'll realize just how much you've been missing. Let's dive in. Our first stop is Africa, a continent often portrayed in textbooks as a place of poverty and chaos. But did you know that long before European colonization, Africa was home to some of the world's most powerful and sophisticated empires? The Kingdom of Mali, for example, was so wealthy that its ruler, Mansa Musa, is still considered the richest person in history. In the 14th century, he traveled to Mecca with a caravan so lavish that it caused a gold crisis in Egypt. Mali's capital, Timbuktu, was a center of learning, with libraries and universities that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Yet, how often do we hear about this in school? Instead, we're taught that Africa's history began with colonization, a narrative that erases centuries of achievement and innovation. But Africa isn't the only place with a hidden past. Let's move to the United States, where one of the most devastating acts of racial violence was almost erased from history. In 1921, the thriving black community of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was attacked by a white mob. Over 2 days, hundreds of black residents were killed, thousands were left homeless, and the neighborhood was burned to the ground. For decades, this massacre was barely mentioned in history books. Survivors were silenced, and the city tried to pretend it never happened. It wasn't until recently that the truth began to emerge, forcing Americans to confront a painful chapter in their past. Now let's cross the ocean to Asia, where the story of the Opium Wars is often glossed over in Western classrooms. In the 19th century, Britain flooded China with opium, creating a nation of addicts and sparking two brutal wars. The result? China was forced to cede territory, pay huge reparations, and accept humiliating treaties. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation, a period of foreign domination and national trauma. Yet, in many Western schools, the story is reduced to a footnote, if it's mentioned at all. But hidden history isn't just about violence and oppression. Sometimes it's about resilience and resistance. Take the story of the women warriors who defied expectations and changed the course of history. From the Domi Amazons of West Africa to the female samurai of Japan, women have fought and led on the battlefield for centuries.
Yep, their stories are often left out of the narrative, replaced by tales of male heroism. By ignoring these women, we miss out on a richer, more inclusive understanding of the past. And then there are the stories that are hidden in plain sight. The Great Bengal Famine of 1943 killed millions of people in British-ruled India. While natural factors played a role, historians now agree that British policies, especially the diversion of food supplies for the war effort, made the disaster far worse. Yet this tragedy is rarely discussed in British classrooms, and many people in the West have never even heard of it. So, what happens when we uncover these hidden histories? We gain a deeper, more honest understanding of the world. We see that progress is not inevitable, that justice is not guaranteed, and that the past is full of lessons for the present. As we continue this journey, keep an open mind. Some of these stories will challenge what you think you know. Some will make you angry, others will inspire you. But all of them will remind you that history isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today.
Let's go deeper. If you thought the stories you heard in school were the whole truth, prepare to have your mind changed. The next event on our journey is one that rewrites the very idea of what civilization means. Picture this. The year is 1324, and a man named Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, sets out on a pilgrimage to Mecca. His caravan is legendary. Tens of thousands of people, camels loaded with gold, and so much wealth that his generosity causes the price of gold to plummet across North Africa and the Middle East. But the real story isn't just about riches. It's about a thriving African empire with cities, universities, and a culture of learning that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. Timbuktu, the empire's crown jewel, was a beacon of scholarship, attracting thinkers from across the world. Yet for generations, this story was left out of Western textbooks. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative of Africa as a dark continent waiting to be civilized. The truth is, Africa's history is rich, complex, and essential to understanding the world. When we ignore it, we lose sight of what humanity is capable of. Now, let's shift to a story of division and heartbreak that shaped the destinies of millions: the partition of India in 1947. You might have heard that India gained independence from British rule, but what's often left out is the chaos and violence that followed. The British, eager to leave, hastily drew a border between India and the newly created Pakistan. The result was one of the largest mass migrations in history. Over 15 million people forced to leave their homes, crossing borders in search of safety. Communities that had lived together for centuries were torn apart overnight. Violence erupted, with neighbors turning against each other, and an estimated 1 to 2 million people lost their lives. Families were separated, women were abducted, and entire villages disappeared. Yet for many classrooms, the story is reduced to a few lines about independence and freedom. The human cost, the trauma, and the legacy of partition are rarely discussed. But for those who lived through it, the scars remain. Understanding partition isn't just about history. It's about empathy, about seeing the world through the eyes of those who suffered, and about recognizing the dangers of division and hatred. From South Asia, let's travel to the heart of America, to a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1921, the Greenwood District was known as Black Wall Street, a vibrant, prosperous Black community with businesses, theaters, and a spirit of self-reliance. But all of that changed in a single night. Fueled by racism and resentment, a white mob descended on Greenwood, burning homes and businesses, killing hundreds, and leaving thousands homeless. The city was left in ruins, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. For decades, the massacre was covered up. Official records were destroyed, and the story was erased from textbooks. It wasn't until survivors began to speak out and historians started digging that the truth came to light. The Tulsa Race Massacre isn't just a story of violence. It's a story of resilience, of a community that refused to be defined by tragedy. But it's also a reminder of how easily history can be hidden, and how important it is to listen to those whose voices have been silenced. Now, let's look at a different kind of hidden history, one that involves global politics, addiction, and the struggle for power. In the 19th century, Britain was desperate to balance its trade with China. The solution? Opium. British merchants began smuggling opium into China, creating a nation of addicts and sparking a crisis that would change the world. When the Chinese government tried to stop the trade, Britain responded with force, launching the Opium Wars. The result was a series of humiliating treaties that forced China to open its ports, cede territory, and pay massive reparations. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of a century of foreign domination and national humiliation for China, a trauma that still shapes Chinese identity today. Yet in many Western classrooms, the story is told from the perspective of trade and diplomacy, glossing over the human cost and the role of imperialism. The real lesson of the Opium Wars isn't just about drugs or treaties. It's about the consequences of greed, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of seeing history from multiple perspectives. But hidden history isn't always about nations and empires. Sometimes it's about individuals, people who defied the odds and changed the world, even if their names never made it into the textbooks. Take the story of the Dahomey Amazons, an all-female military regiment in what is now Benin. For centuries, these women fought alongside men, defending their kingdom against invaders and earning a reputation as fierce warriors. Their existence challenges everything we think we know about gender roles in history. Yet their story is rarely told, overshadowed by tales of male heroism. By uncovering stories like this, we expand our understanding of what's possible, and we honor the courage of those who refuse to be limited by society's expectations. As we move through these stories, a pattern emerges. The events that get left out of history are often the ones that challenge the status quo. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question the narratives we've been taught, and to see the world in a new light. But that's exactly why they matter. When we learn about the hidden corners of history, we become more critical, more compassionate, and more connected to the world around us. So, as we continue this journey, ask yourself, what else have I missed? What other stories are waiting to be discovered? The past is full of secrets, and the only way to find them is to keep asking questions, to keep digging, and to never accept the official version as the whole truth. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember.
Let's keep going, because the deeper we dig, the more we realize just how much has been left out of the story we thought we knew. Imagine a world where entire populations vanish, not because of war or disease, but because their very existence is erased from memory. That's what happened to countless indigenous civilizations in the Americas. When most people think of pre-Columbian America, they picture a handful of tribes or the mighty Aztecs and Incas. But the truth is far more complex and far more tragic. Before European contact, the Americas were home to hundreds of advanced societies, each with their own languages, technologies, and ways of life. The Mississippian culture, for example, built massive cities like Cahokia, with pyramids that rivaled those of Egypt. The city was a center of trade, religion, and politics, bustling with tens of thousands of people. Yet when European settlers arrived, they brought diseases that decimated these populations. Within a few generations, entire civilizations disappeared, their cities reclaimed by forests, and their stories lost to time. Today, most people have never even heard of Cahokia or the many other cultures that once thrived across the continent. Their erasure isn't just a loss for indigenous peoples, it's a loss for all of humanity, a reminder of how fragile memory can be.
But the erasure of history isn't always about ancient times. Sometimes it happens right before our eyes. Take the story of the Cambodian genocide. In the late 1970s, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized control of Cambodia and set out to create a classless society. In just 4 years, nearly 2 million people, almost a quarter of the population, were killed through execution, starvation, and forced labor. The regime targeted intellectuals, professionals, and anyone suspected of opposing their vision. The country's cities were emptied, its culture destroyed, and its people traumatized. For years, the world looked away, and even today, the Cambodian genocide is rarely discussed in classrooms outside Southeast Asia. The lesson here is chilling. When we ignore the warning signs of extremism and dehumanization, the consequences can be catastrophic. Now, let's turn to a story that sounds like science fiction, but is all too real. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA launched a secret program known as MK Ultra. The goal? To develop mind control techniques that could be used against America's enemies. The methods were shocking. Unwitting subjects were dosed with LSD, subjected to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even torture. Some never recovered. The program was so secretive that even Congress didn't know about it until years later, when investigative journalists and whistleblowers forced the truth into the open. MK Ultra isn't just a story about government overreach. It's a warning about what can happen when secrecy and power go unchecked. Yet for decades, it was left out of history books, dismissed as a conspiracy theory until the evidence became undeniable. But hidden history isn't always about darkness. Sometimes it's about hope, about people who refused to accept the world as it was and fought to make it better. Consider the story of the women's suffrage movement. In many countries, the fight for women's right to vote was long, difficult, and often violent. Women were arrested, beaten, and ridiculed for demanding equality. Yet their courage changed the world, paving the way for future generations. Still, the stories of these women are often reduced to a few names and dates, their struggles overshadowed by the achievements of men. By remembering their stories, we honor their sacrifices and remind ourselves that progress is never easy. It's won through persistence, solidarity, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. Let's not forget the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, a tragedy that killed millions in British-ruled India. While natural disasters played a role, historians now agree that British policies, especially the diversion of food for the war effort and the refusal to provide relief, made the famine far worse. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, is reported to have said that the famine was the fault of the Indians for breeding like rabbits. The suffering was immense. Families torn apart, children starving, entire villages wiped out. Yet this story is rarely taught in British schools, and many people in the West have never even heard of it. The Bengal famine isn't just a story of hunger, it's a story of indifference, of how the powerful can ignore the suffering of the powerless, and of the importance of holding leaders accountable for their actions. As we move through these stories, a pattern becomes clear. The events that get left out of history are often the ones that challenge our sense of who we are. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our countries, our leaders, and ourselves. But that's exactly why they matter. When we learn about the hidden corners of history, we become more critical, more compassionate, and more connected to the world around us. So, what can we do with this knowledge? First, we can question the stories we've been told. We can seek out new perspectives, listen to voices that have been silenced, and refuse to accept the official version as the whole truth. Second, we can share what we learn. By telling these stories, we keep them alive, and we make it harder for others to erase them. Finally, we can use history as a tool for change. When we understand the past, we're better equipped to fight for justice in the present. The journey isn't over yet. There are still more stories to uncover, more truths to face, and more lessons to learn.